Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. We like to talk about all kinds of topics, and it includes topics that we might not want to talk about, or we have a lot of shame around, or we don't really want to go there because of the shame. The shame wants us to kind of hide it. And I'm here to tell you, we all have parts of how we look, our bodies, maybe our faces, any part of our body that we do not like. And then there's everything's on a continuum. You might feel severe hatred towards your body, or you might, on a continuum, have just some things you don't really like that much. You might have a way of life that your image and how you look drive so many things. Maybe what you do, what you don't do, maybe with social media. I know it can play a role with me in terms of social media. Like I record this podcast, we put it on social media, and it can bring up feelings like, oh man, you're nodding your head a lot, or you look this way today, or look at your hair. It can bring up criticism within myself. And I have to practice self-compassion and what we talked about in today's episode. There's so much more to this life where this is a body that's important to connect with, to feel, to notice what you feel. And then how do we move through this? And it's an epidemic in my mind and my work that I do. It touches every single person, especially teens. And if you're a parent, it's important you're doing this work, or you won't be able to help your teen, or you won't be able to help your adult child in a way. So doing your own work around this is the key to working through overcoming body hatred or things you don't like about your body or how you look. We put so much emphasis on how we look that we think our worth and value comes from that, and it doesn't. And in today's episode, we tie in how symptoms have a soul. I'm using Kathryn's words because that really resonated with me. This is a spiritual journey we're on. We're not talking about dogma. We're talking about knowing there's something else higher than us out there. Not religifying, but to bring what you want to this. Bring what is calling you. What is begging you to awaken? What is your pain trying to show you? And that is so key. And we tie that all in today. And sometimes it can go real far out there and you might be like, whoa. But it spoke to my soul. It really did. And I hope it speaks to yours. And take what resonates, discard the rest. We talk about the thesis for her book, Overcoming Body Hatred, and how it even came up with that title, because I think that's a pretty deep title. I mean, we're going there. And so I really hope that when you listen to this, again, just notice what your body feels. Get curious, stay curious, and let whatever's there be there. And you don't have to buy into everything. That's not the point. That's the whole purpose of work. You don't have to be threatened by what other people say. It's by how they show up. There's no threat to anybody else, but it's how you show up in the world. How do you feel secure within yourself? Dr. Kathryn Holt, she has her PhD and she's a psychotherapist and a licensed clinical social worker. She's a depth psychologist. When we get into that, it's very important. In private practice in Longmont, Colorado, specializing in body acceptance, soul work, and postpartum support. She writes about bodies, motherhood, and spirituality within healing while bridging the fields of like Carl Jung and behavioral psychology. She studied dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, at Columbia University and completed her PhD in depth psychology with a focus on Jungian and archetypal psychology. I may not be saying that just perfect, but that's okay. Her research focused on how people make peace with their bodies after suffering with body hatred. Her therapeutic approach draws from Carl Jung, behavioral and feminist psychology. Dr. Holt is the author of Overcoming Body Hatred Workbook and the co-author of the well-received Stronger Than BPD Journal Her practice offers individual therapy, workshops, and retreats, and focused on supporting people and connecting more deeply with themselves and the world around us. So I just want to say, I am so grateful for all of you. If you want links to the book and other resources, I've been asking each guest a key question that will be included in the show notes and in the newsletter. Get on the list at Kristen, KRISTEND, Boyce, BOICE.com/free resources. And those are Amazon links to the actual books, and that helps support the podcast. So thank you for listening. And my intention is for this to be informative, expanding, and helpful. So here is my conversation with Kathryn. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. This is a topic I have not talked about on the podcast. It's one that I encourage you to stay open, see what comes through. If you want to write anything down, I always am about see what comes through, whatever is there. Let's hold space for that, because this is a tender subject for many people as how they see themselves and how they see their bodies. And there's lots of layers to this. So I just want to introduce my guest, or welcome my guest, I should say, Kathryn Holt. Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. What drew me to your work was the title of your workbook. I was like, that I reached out to you because of it and have taken a deeper dive in your work and think it's so important to really have a conversation about. And I love the overcoming body hatred. I mean, you kind of named it with a pretty intense title.
Yeah. Which I didn't choose myself, but yeah, my publisher was pretty clear that it needed to be specific. So that's what we went with. Yeah.
Okay. What was your title? Now I'm curious.
I wanted it to be True Hunger. And they were like, with all due respect, that could be a cookbook or a vampire novel. So we need to be clear what this is. So overcoming body hatred is where we landed. Yeah.
Okay. And I can see that. I love both titles. They're different. I can see both perspectives. Tell me how this journey of writing this book, even this topic, began for you.
Well, my interest in the topic began, like so many of us, with my own recovery from difficulty living in my own body. And that was kind of a developmental journey I went through in adolescence into young adulthood, and through my own recovery process and personal development and therapeutic work. I got into my own therapy and became a therapist myself. And then it turned into kind of the area of focus that I was really interested in. And I became a therapist, got my master's in social work from Columbia, which was more behavioral. And then through from in my early career, I was really trying to blend this highly behavioral, kind of traditional academic background with what was really natural for me, which is more spiritual orientation and embodiment work and things like that. And that kind of led me to studying depth psychology and Jungian psychology specifically. And when I went to get my PhD, I decided to, really kind of develop the work I had been working on around embodiment and how disconnecting from our bodies leads to not understanding ourselves spiritually. So the idea of course, I developed called True Hunger was, the soundbite is, physical hunger is the portal to spiritual hunger. So being able to connect with what we want on that embodied level helps us connect to that deeper soul call. And it's hard to connect with the true soul call if we're not connected with our bodies. So I had developed a body of work around that and then decided to make that a little bit more concrete with research. And so I developed my PhD research around that. I wrote my dissertation during COVID with a baby, and it was so hard. And I was like, I need this to not die on the shelf of academia. So I proposed the book to a publisher I'd worked with before. And that's where the book came from. Yeah. So it's really a blending of my own experience, but then met by research where I was like, I need stories, I need data, I need to understand this from other people too. So that's where it came from, really.
It's really powerful. I mean, really, you go to Columbia and it's behavior based. And then
Yeah,
by doing your own work, and then you decided, oh, I have a thirst for something more spiritual. Did you know it was more spiritual?
I did. I mean, even at Columbia, I studied dialectical behavior therapy and I did an intensive, that's kind of where most of my career for a long time settled was in DBT. And I was drawn to that because of the mindfulness aspect. It was like the closest thing I could find. But the idea of wise mind and DBT is intuition. It's that deep self. And that thread really supported me in doing that behavioral work because ultimately we're trying to get to that wise mind place. So I found it, but I had to kind of dig for it. But then, when I was left to my own devices, I could find more of what I was looking for.
Yes, I love this work.
Yeah, but the spiritual has always sort of been there for me. It's just harder to find in a highly behavioral setting.
And what I find is interesting is you connected that the body was essential to
Yeah,
connect to the spiritual components.
yeah, for sure. I mean, even on a really basic level, if we've learned to disconnect from our bodies, then it's hard to even feel our emotions. I bet you see this with clients. Like if we're preoccupied with thinking about our bodies, the idea of connecting with spirit and soul is not even kind of on the menu. We need to connect with that felt sensation, emotional experience. And that helps us connect with what is meaningful, where we're actually drawn. Even anger helps us know what we need or what we don't want. It's like, get out of my boundary bubble, or like, you're not giving me what I need. We need to be connected to that deep instinctual emotional space that's embodied. Anger, I feel that in my chest and my stomach. People feel it differently, but connecting with our body helps us know what we value. And that really, I don't really know another way to be on the spiritual path. I mean, I do know another way because I live in Boulder. I think a lot of people are in kind of a disembodied path, but it's not grounded, right? It's not necessarily connected with this grounded way that we're thinking about living a soul calling. It can get very theoretical and ungrounded and unactionable.
Yes, because what you're helping people do is get, and we've used that embodied word oftentimes with my team. We're starting to really like kind of notice, are you embodied? What does that mean to you? How do you define embodiment? So if someone's like, I don't even know what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's so simple that we can feel the sensations in our bodies below our neck. And also in our face, like our face carries a lot of emotional information, but being embodied is literally being able to feel sensation. Cold, warm, hungry, not hungry, tense, open. It's not very complicated in that way, but if we have lived decades thinking about how we feel kind of more theoretically, like I think I'm angry versus sensing in this moment, where do I feel that in my body? Oh, okay, my stomach is tight. Maybe I'm actually more worried about this versus angry about being embodied is feeling sensation. It's not much more complicated than that.
And that's how you can get grounding. Because if you're not in your body,
Yeah,
it's hard to be grounded then.
right. Feeling those sensations helps us also know whether to act on them or not. That behavioral perspective is also helpful there. If I feel something in my body and I can actually do some self-inquiry around it, does this match the situation? What does this emotion make me want to do? Do I really want to do that? It gives that pause more naturally of let's inquire, like, what am I feeling? Why? Where is that coming from? And do I want to act on this or not? And then we get to choose. It kind of like slows the whole thing down.
Yes. How did you get into depth psychology? For those that don't know what that is, can you explain it? And then what was your draw
Yeah.
to it?
Well, my draw to depth psychology started with there was that spiritual thread that I was always kind of tracking and curious about. Depth psychology is the study of the unconscious. The unconscious is the field of psyche that, if you think about the image of the iceberg, right? Like what we're conscious of is that little tip of the iceberg that we think is totality, think is reality. But underneath the water, right, is like the huge iceberg that has its own ecosystem. And that's one image to think of our waking self, and then the unconscious that is informing that tiny little bit. And in depth psychology, we think about the ego, that top part of the iceberg, learning actually that it's being informed by the larger iceberg. The other image that I often use and I use in my book is the idea of the acorn and the oak tree. Like the acorn, when it's a little thing, thinks it's the only game in town. But as it starts to plant and grow, it's the oak tree that's informing it. Like, this is where you need to grow. This is where you need to push. Like, this is where soften or steady.
Yes.
And that's the idea of like the ego becoming aware of the self, the larger capital S guiding self or soul. And that's what we're looking at is what is the unconscious soul trying to guide us towards, and what's undeveloped that needs to get strengthened, and what's too developed that needs to get softened. And so in depth psychology, we're looking at dreams and intuition and the somatic unconscious, like the body, to help us understand that. And the way I got into that is really through, I had gone into shamanic studies. I had really kind of gone more into the spiritual, and it didn't feel like it wasn't my culture. It wasn't where I felt kind of in integrity. You know, I'm not of indigenous cultures in that way, but depth psychology felt like it met me more culturally, and I didn't feel like I was appropriating as much, but it still really satisfied that the reverence for dreams, the reverence for soul, and these larger guiding figures that we're not in control of, frankly.
Yeah, this is speaking my language. And I've done a lot of that in therapy, kind of this guide. Does depth psychology use guided processing in a way? Like where you're
we call it
your
active imagination.
Okay.
Maybe like journeying, if shamanic journeying is one way. Active imagination was like Carl Jung called kind of that deep imaginal work where you're like looking at parts or suspending
or guides,
threshold or guides. Yeah, that could be. We don't necessarily call them guides, but similar, I would say.
What would you call them? Loved ones? Or do you have words for it? Or you just?
Well, we get into some like archetypal psychology as distinct from Gestalt or parts work IFS, really sees those aspects that if we're working with a part or, you know, an image from a dream, it really sees those beings as independent in their own right, not necessarily there for the development of the human ego. In archetypal psychology, same with shamanic traditions, we're decentering the human ego for the experience of interfacing with something different than our known way. So it's different in that, you know, with IFS or Gestalt therapy, and I've trained in Gestalt in New York, went to an institute, and I love, love, love that work. It's just a different perspective that, you know, I have this dream about this person and I think of it as part of me. And in depth psychology, we don't assume that. It might be, but we don't assume it. Or a tiger in a dream is not part of me that's a tiger. It's a tiger in the collective unconscious that I'm interfacing with. It's like
metaphorical kind of in nature, like the tiger would be or no?
It's more like what is, like this being that came to us in a dream that we're invited to interface with in the dream. So it's a pretty different way. Different way of practicing psychology, actually, than the sort of Western, like human potential movement. It's a little bit different than that. It's more like we're connecting with the larger. It's a little more expansive. And it's not so much about human potential and like maximizing the human. It's opening to the mystery. I would say that kind of more opening to the mystery.
I love this. It's more soulful. And I got that from reading everything on your website. It's more intuition, more soul, more spirit. Like that is the basis. And then how does that tie into, because there's 5 chapters in your book, conclusion and all those things. How does that tie into body image?
That's such a good question. Well, the way that I wrote the book, the thread, was that recovering from body hatred is a path to soul. So that the process of recovery itself is an initiatory, soulful process. So we're not just trying to do like a quick fix. Like there's tons of ways to cope with body image hatred. And I just didn't write that book but they exist. And there's tools in the book but the idea is that the recovery is meaningful, that the suffering is meaningful, and that the symptoms that we experience are important, not just the thing that we're trying to get over. We are trying to feel more relaxed in our bodies, but the process of it is the symptom itself, the body hatred symptom is important. And the symptom actually has soul. And so much of what we're looking for is how do we engage even with the parts of us that are suffering in a reverent way. And so just to make that tangible and practical, I broke down the steps in kind of as much of a linear way as possible. But in my research, there is kind of a path of coming to a point where struggling with the body is it just hits a crescendo. And it's like, I can't do this anymore. My body's not responding to the attempts I'm throwing at it. It's just not responding anymore. And I'm sick of this. And the wheel of suffering just is exhausting. So a lot of people experience, that crisis, like the blessing of the crisis point of like, I can't do this anymore. And that like dark night of the soul tends to create enough energy to start some change work. And then working with the mind is essential. We know that through cognitive behavioral research, but from a depth psychological perspective, still, we do need to work with the mind. We have to sort through what are we thinking about the body versus what are we feeling? Where did those thoughts come from? Who do they sound like? Are they mine? Did they come from my parents or culture? So working with the mind and learning how to identify emotion is really foundational. Then we go into sensing the body, like we talked about at the beginning, which it's one of those simple but not easy. Learning how to just one drop at a time, start to titrate and feel sensation just by slowing down and tracking and practicing some movement. And then the last step is that I wrote about in the book is about soul and connecting with soul through dream work or ritual and things like that. So it offers a little bit of a structure for that journey of like sorting out the mess of the mind, right? With body hatred. That's really where a lot of the preoccupation lands. But to start to land in the body and to open to that more soulful dimension is, I hope that also comes through.
This is so much deeper than just the cognitive part. It's more expansive.
Yeah. Well, I think of the journey to recover from body hatred as potentially a spiritual path. If you've ever worked with people who are struggling with their body, I'll take like the extreme version of an eating disorder. Eating disorders are highly private and ritualistic. They are not shared, and people don't want to talk about them. Mm-hmm. It is hard for people to seek help. It is hard for people. There's so much shame involved, but they're also very protected. Like they are these private, protected spaces. And if we think about that symbolically, not just pathologically, to me, it just always seems like this attempt to connect with something spiritual and this inner private realm that we did not get support with in our culture. And in the behavioral language, we think of like, what's the function of the behavior? What's that kernel of wisdom that's motivating the self-destructive behavior? Well, sometimes it's a seeking of a spiritual, private, ritualistic experience. And we can do that even in recovery. And yeah, so I think that's a little bit of a through line for me too.
One of the things you said that I think I want to repeat and kind of lean into is the symptom has soul.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit for what you mean by the symptom has soul? Because I just was like, oh, resonates.
Our culture and Western psychology has really thought of pathology as something you fix. It's like, oh, we don't like that. Let's just fix it and we'll cope. But if we think of our symptoms, like what we're struggling with, if it was that easy, we would not have problems. We wouldn't struggle. If it was as easy to cope with a psychological symptom, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, body hatred, and CBT and changing your thoughts and changing your behavior was that easy, then we would not have therapists. Well, maybe we would, and it would be like done. But to me, when we think about symptoms of soul, the reason why they're so tricky is that they have a purpose. We call it like in depth psychology, we call it a teleological function. Like they want to do something. They're trying to do something. And so the symptom, it's trying to do something. And if we can listen, sometimes we can hear what is it it's trying to do. And depression, like for one example, sometimes takes us into that underworld, underground, like lack of energy, total submersion experience to connect with something deeper in ourselves. It tells us what needs to change. It helps us get to know the darker aspects of our own life, our own difficulties. Like it has a purpose to grow us up, is how I think about it. It's like the symptom has soul, is that it's purposeful.
Yeah, that's beautiful. How do you define soul? So if someone says, now, I don't even know, like I get the idea of a soul, but what does soul mean?
That's such a good question. Let's see. I've answered this over and over. And then when pressed,
I get you.
Kind
so
of
just whatever comes through, just
so
whatever.
Soul, yeah. Soul is the part of us that interfaces with our personal unconscious, with the collective unconscious, and is more than us. So soul, I think of as that oak tree that's guiding the acorn that doesn't exist yet. That's how I would say that. Soul connects us with that territory that is meaningful, potential, and yet isn't tangible. It's not tangible.
Which is hard for folks because we want to see, we want to feel, we want to.
But this developing the sense, you can feel what's soulful. If you read, I bet people can tell a difference between if you read an article that had soul in it 100%. And one that was written just from someone's, like, you can feel that poetry versus, I don't like to distinguish it that much because I'm not a big poetry person, but you can feel where there's soul. And so it's not like we're not going to hang on to it real tight, but I think we have a sense for that as humans.
So this is big because I haven't heard it put like this. And I think this is an important conversation to say body hatred is a symptom. Well, let me make sure I'm saying this correctly. Jump in here. Feel free to tweak what I'm saying or what. Okay. So body hatred is a symptom which has soul.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you think on a kind of one concrete way to think about that is imagine that your eyes are focused on your body, right? It's like the lens is turned in. This drives me crazy. So much of the body hatred recovery work is to learn to send that lens back out. What am I looking at? What do I not like? What am I introjecting or turning inwards that needs to be projected, turned outwards? And that connects us to soul. I don't like that. This upsets me. It connects us to that. It's like the magic question that I often talk about is, if I wasn't hating my body, what would I be thinking about? If we trust that energy is trying to go somewhere, where is it trying to go? There's momentum. It just might be directed in the wrong way, but we're taught to direct it towards the body, particularly the feminine body. So if it was directed in a different way, there's so much energy there.
Okay, so let's just put it practical. So let's say someone looks in the mirror and they're like, I hate my skin. I'm making this up, but okay. We all have things that maybe we struggle with because we're human with the soul, spirit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I look in the mirror and I say, oh, I hate my skin. You're saying, if I ask myself, what else say that again, the question, just to make it go deeper.
If I wasn't hating my skin today,
if I wasn't
what would I be thinking about?
What would I be thinking about? And let that guide you.
Yeah. If I wasn't getting distracted, if the lens wasn't turned onto my skin, what would it be turned onto? If I hadn't been taught to focus on my skin, What would I be thinking
Oh,
about?
that's a good one. If I wasn't taught to be focused on my skin or my body or my weight, or
Yeah.
it can be
And this
multitude of things.
doesn't, it can be anything, right? We
Yes.
all, it's
Anything.
that inner eye. If we're taught to turn that gaze inward
Yes.
and critically, right? We need an inward gaze that helps us connect with self inquiry, self awareness. But that's different, right? Obviously, than that inner critic that is super ego turned in versus that turned out. What's going on? And this doesn't mean that we don't care about our appearance. I think that's where we tolerate gray. We
Yes.
can care about what we look like. We can care about a lot of times when people come to intuitive eating or treating their bodies more respectfully, there's sort of a pendulum swing from control to thinking like, I'm not going to do anything with my body if I trust what you're saying. And actually, that's
I
not
actually had
true.
someone say that to me. Well, then I'm just
If
going to
you're
let myself
connected to your
go.
body, and that's where you have the foundational piece is connecting with your body. Our bodies don't want to do that. Our bodies want to eat well. Our bodies want to move. They want to rest. They want to connect. But if we're not connected with our body, then it's very easy for that pendulum to swing. And that can be part of recovery where then we kind of find a middle ground. But that's why that embodiment is hard, but it's not something that can be skipped over or it doesn't stick. Then we're on that pendulum over and over, which is really just that dieting complex again.
And so people that have been on the dieting complex, let's say they've been on the dieting journey, because that's maybe they were raised that way. Mom
Yeah.
took them to Weight Watchers at a young age.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Okay. So they start even asking that question would be a great one for them. If I wasn't worried about my diet, would that be appropriate?
Yeah. It's like it's like opening the lens a little. What if I could think about something else? Like it's just a what if. Like, what if I didn't spend all day worrying about my body today? What would I do?
It's creating an opening. It's creating
It's an opening. Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
Okay. This is such a good conversation. The other question I think people might have is when you say spiritual, what does that mean to you? Like, for example, when you're like, this is, we can open it's more, you were talking a lot about spiritual.
I mean, it's an awareness or a willingness to connect, be aware of, work with something larger than ourselves. I don't think it has to be more complicated than that, but something larger than ourselves.
I like that. It's what it is. I mean, that resonates. And so how does spiritual connections or expansions or however we want to frame this come into play when someone doesn't like how they see themselves in the mirror?
I think we all have that connection, like the ability for that connection. Some more temperamentally than not. Temperament is important. Some people just temperamentally are going to be like, this spiritual stuff is like not for me. And that's fine. But for those who resonate with it, it is a huge resource in recovery. Even just kind of a guiding serenity prayer of God, nature, universe, like grant me the serenity to not hate my body today. Mm-hmm. Having like a larger support system, with any kind of trauma work, we're tapping into a larger support, like pulling in support. So we can think about that in a spiritual way, in a trauma-informed way. It doesn't really matter. It's like, but when we're struggling with something that we cannot control, we often need to tap into something larger, something to hold us and trust in. And that's how I think about it. It also adds purpose. It's like, it brings that idea of like symptom and soul. It helps that this struggle is purposeful, that it's helping us become someone wiser, someone who's been through something. Like I remember I worked with this teenager years ago and we had done eating disorder work together. And I don't work with teens as much anymore, but she said, I was like, why do you think you went through all that? Just like as a postmortem. And she was like, I wanted to go through something dark. And I was like, whoa, that was such a beautiful, she wanted that. And nobody would want that through that lens. But our culture has lost initiatory rites of passage where they're held like dark trials. We're like self-initiating a lot in our culture. But I think we go through that even as adults of like, there's a way that it creates wisdom to go through something hard, and recovery is something really hard, but we come out the other side like wiser.
We do. I have a ring that says, hear my soul speak. It's just a friendly reminder. Like there's more to this pain. I know that cliche, pain turns into purpose. I mean, and
It's true, right?
It's such a
Yeah.
truth that rings true in my body. I just doing this for so long, you doing this for so long. It's just a truth. It just
Yeah.
feels true. It feels like an
Yeah.
embodiment of truth. And when someone's in it, you're not going to be like, well, this pain is going to turn into I mean, that's not helpful,
Totally. No.
right? Me
No.
just holding that space for it all to be there and it's okay to be seen and empathically witnessed. This conversation to me feels so empowering because we're not just talking about cognition's important, but it's so much deeper, more expansive than that. There's
And, to say like if someone is currently struggling, the idea of a spiritual path or recovery, that's probably like, that's a little much.
yes.
But when you're looking in the mirror and like, it's annoying today to hate your body. We talked about that magical question. Like, if I wasn't thinking about this, what would I be thinking about this? But also to say, what am I feeling? To shift from thinking about the body to feeling the body. That's the other, I mean, there's no other way to recover. I mean, there's just not like, we have to shift from thinking about the body to feeling. And that connects us to soul and spirit too. But it can be as simple as like, I'm feeling my body and like pissed about that thing that happened. And that's more real than hating our body. Like, we want to open to the possibility of our emotions being wise guides. We want to listen to emotion more than that inner critic.
Yes. I work so much on emotion, just people really connecting to it. Where does it live in your body?
Yeah.
And it can be more than one. We can have many
Yep.
and different, it's not just one. You can have
Yep.
multiple emotions and you can shift 1 second from the next.
Yeah. And I think that conflict, often when emotions are in conflict, that can create anxiety. And then the protection can be that old defense mechanism of hating the body, right? So unpacking all that is part of the process of like, if I'm feeling conflicting emotions, am I getting anxious and then I hate my body? Like, is that a possible pattern I'm noticing? Or can I start to tolerate, like, okay, I'm having multiple emotions here and I can handle it. I can tolerate this complexity.
We work a lot on window of tolerance, being able to tolerate and really be able to say, I'm okay. And let's just see what's here. Let's just get curious and stay curious and compassionate to what might be here and increasing that, just even if it's a little bit at a time. What has been one, and I know this is a question I didn't prep you on, so feel free to take your time. I'm just starting to ask this more recently because I'm more curious. Like, has there been a book or a couple of books that have been a way to expand yourself or maybe meant the most to you or just opened you up in a different way?
On this topic, I need to think about it because the first book that comes to my mind is I'm a mother to an 8-month-old and a 5-year-old. And I mothered during the pandemic and I was a new mother during the pandemic. And the book that speaks to me so deeply is Night Bitch. Have you heard of Night Bitch?
I have not, but
oh my God.
Is it so good?
They've turned it into a movie with Amy Adams recently that I'm a little skeptical of, but we'll see. But it's about a mother who turns into a wolf. And just out of like the desperation and boredom of early motherhood, she becomes a wolf. And that book really, to me, was so depth psychological, but also validated just the difficulty of motherhood and early motherhood for me. And so it's not specifically about what we're talking about, but it has that like symptom as soul idea, transformation. In the book, she like literally becomes a wolf, and that's instinct, desire, wildness. And that's what we're talking about too. Like, what if we didn't hate our bodies and we're more wild? What if?
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yes. That is so good.
Yeah, undomesticated. Like, what if we became a little less domesticated here?
Because those transitions into motherhood they're big, especially when you add another one to the mix. I mean, it's a whole, and then the pandemic. So mind you, like that's a whole nother, it is.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, a book when I was in recovery, I liked Women, Food, and God by Janine Roth, although like I'll do an asterisk that sometimes her work is a little like weight phobic, but I did like that one years ago. And what is it? Fat is a feminist issue was pretty guiding. I need to look at my bookshelf. Yeah. Fat is a feminist issue. Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes is like a Bible. And then I have all these dream books. Belonging by Toko Pa Turner is gorgeous. about soul and dreams, and she just can articulate it in an amazing way.
Yeah.
So those are a few.
Oh, I love these. Thank you for sharing those. And I know I threw you for a loop because I didn't prep you on that question. So thank you.
I love what comes through without a prep.
I do too. This is my favorite thing. That's why I love conversations. It's like, oh, let's just see what comes through. Whatever's meant to come through will come through. And I'm like, okay, we're just going to leave it at that. Is there anything else that you feel like came through or that you wanted to share or you thought it was important that we didn't cover?
One thing that I think is important is to think about the difference between body hatred, body neutrality, and body positivity. A lot of people are kind of focused on body positivity, and ideally, we like our body. Ideally, it's a positive relationship. But I think at the beginning, often that's kind of an added pressure. And so a lot of what I work with is body neutrality, body respect. It's like, can we just basically respect our body instead of hating it? And without feeling the pressure to love it, hopefully we'll love it. But what if it's just respected? And body neutrality, I think, is kind of where I tend to land.
Yeah, I like that. I like that perspective. So that makes a lot of sense. If people are like, I love what Kathryn said, and they want to find out more about you, I'm going to link your books in the show notes. Where else can they find you? Because your website is amazing too. So
mostly my website, KathrynCHolt.com. I am very ambivalent about social media. So sometimes I'm on it and sometimes I'm not. But I have like a couple posts on Instagram that's Dr. Kathryn C. Holt. Mostly my website and my newsletter. I share a lot of writing in my newsletter, and I feel like that's kind of the main place that I share.
Awesome. Thank you. And I know you offer programs here and there. So people that are, whenever you offer them, could get on your mailing list and then find out about that too. Yes, go pick up the workbook because this also does a lot of self-reflection. And I think that's one of the keys when you're doing any kind of work to open you up, to process it, to expand you. Overcoming Body Hatred Workbook, grab it. I'll link it in the show notes. Get it, work through it. I always say do the work if you can in the workbook.
Yeah.
It just makes a difference to integrate.
Yeah, it does. It actually makes it real versus theoretical.
Yes. And so that's another layer of embodiment to begin that. Just really take that and decide to do a chapter at a time or a couple pages at a time or whatever you can manage. I say, go grab it. And thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world and your time today. I am super grateful. It was a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, KRISTEN, DBoice, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.